So thanks for coming. We're going to have a nice small group here to talk about BizTalk 2013. How many of you are using, what version are you using today, or are you just getting started with BizTalk?
Well, I think the BizTalk, I've been on a brief kind of training course for the BizTalk 2009
Yep.
course, but my previous job was in the area of BPMN.
Okay.
And I've been working with another tool like ActiveOS, similar thing, but mostly in the modeling area, but then just doing kind of integration of data from BPMN based on to the BPL to the ActiveOS.
Sure.
So that's my area. But I'm looking for the BizTalk in my new job as an option. So that's why I'm here and interested in this stuff.
Okay.
Well, we use 2010.
Yep.
I don't develop it personally, I'm an architect, so I'm interested to see what features this has that might make it easier to do some stuff.
Okay.
We're on 2010. Well, I think we got an installation of 2006 still. It's kind of hard to migrate, but
Yep. Yeah, as soon as you get invested, you have a lot of big projects.
yeah,
It takes a while.
Almost there.
Yeah.
Ongoing project for 2 years.
Wow. What about you?
Yeah, the team uses 2010. I'm just looking to see what's in 2013.
Okay. Cool. Well, hopefully this will give you the information that you need. This is a little bit about me. I'm an independent consultant, and I kind of split my time between doing hands-on consulting with clients on BizTalk and other things, with offering for Pluralsight and doing courses on BizTalk and Windows Azure and all sorts of connected system stuff. Anybody know what trophy is?
What is that?
Jump up and down on a pogo stick?
No. I love that word. I had to put it in there. It's beard growing. So I keep running into people. I grew this out since, I don't know, November, and every time I run into somebody, nobody recognizes me. So you'll have to remember my name because my face will never look the same. I may not even have hair to shave it. So that's just a little fun fact about me. It drives my wife crazy. She keeps asking me when I'm going to get rid of this, which just makes me want to grow it that much more. So we're going to start just talking about some of the basics. What happens when they do an upgrade of BizTalk, some of the core things that they end up aligning with that. And then we'll talk about one of their big pushes with 2013, which is figuring out BizTalk plus Windows Azure. Obviously today everything with Microsoft has to have something to do with the cloud. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Some of the new adapters. We'll talk about some of the performance improvements. So as you're thinking about, we have 2010, do we move to 2013? Those might help make that decision. And then we'll talk about some of the updates to the management tools and the ESB toolkit. And given that we have such a small group, we'll leave plenty of time at the end for questions about BizTalk 2013 or BizTalk in general. So, of course, when they do an update, one of the big things is always platform support. And I put this under the basics because it's just kind of an ongoing joke, right? Every time they upgrade, okay, now we support Windows Server 2012, SQL 2012, Visual Studio 2012, but you might already be using Visual Studio 2013 and SQL 2012 R2, and now SQL 2014 is out. Every time they release, it's not very long before the next version of all the tools comes out. It's one of those ongoing things as a BizTalk developer that you often have two of everything running. One of the things that the team did talk about in, I guess it was November, they had a BizTalk summit in Redmond, and they are working on a more frequent cadence for releasing these kinds of updates, and hopefully they'll actually stick to it. Scott Guthrie was there, and he was their boss, so I'm hoping that now that they've kind of got that laid out there and the commitment, that we'll see that. So I think you'll see more frequent releases, maybe not as often as things happen in the cloud, like every 6 weeks or 6 months, but it sounded like they were committed to trying every year to push out a release or an R2 kind of thing. If nothing else, just to keep aligned with the platforms, because even these things, Windows, SQL, those things are revving faster than BizTalk can keep up, and Visual Studio certainly is doing that. So today we don't have that, but I expect that probably at TechEd, I don't know that you'll hear anything at Build about BizTalk, but at TechEd they may talk about an R2 release for BizTalk 2013 and the support for that. Now, aside from just what new things they support, they also end up dropping off support for things. So that's one of the struggles sometimes with moving from one version to the next is you have to update these things in order. So we just did an upgrade at my client to 2013. We had to look at, well, what version of SQL were we using with BizTalk 2010, and is that still supported? Right? What version of Windows were we running on, is that still supported? And luckily, their installation wasn't that old, so they were running R2 of both Server and SQL Server 2008. So for them, they could just upgrade. We chose to go ahead and upgrade the SQL databases to 2012, just to get some of the performance improvements that come along with that as well. I think he came in and started the camera. So the other piece of the basics is they're continually, as they release new versions, also updating their support for all the different specifications. Any of you do work with EDI, the NFX stuff over here?
HL7.
The HL7, yeah. These are those things where a lot of developers look at this and say, I don't care, right? I don't have to work with it. But if you're in that space, it often absolutely matters that you can support particular things, that they have the schemas out of the box, that they know how to deal with the new versions of the protocols, etc.
What is that server again?
What's that?
Which server you mentioned just? Which support the certificate?
BizTalk 2013 now supports these. These are the
HL7.
The HL.
HS.
Yeah, HL7, which is the for healthcare. The healthcare. So some of these are just schemas, right? So the X12 and the EDIFACT that kind of lump them in the US and the European versions of EDI and who uses what. But the others, like the HL7, sometimes it's about message schemas, and other times it's about the protocol and the adapters as well. And so those they released some updates there to handle ordered messaging better improvements in the performance of the adapters to go with that as well. So again, it's one of those things where I wish they would just every 6 months throw out a feature pack and say, here are these things instead of waiting for a big release. And we may see that going forward, but it's nice to see these. The benefit here is, unlike the platforms, they don't tend to drop off support for the early stuff, which if you use this is probably more likely an issue that somebody's using something 10 years old. It's great that they have support for version 5040, but I've got one of my customer clients that are still using 3010 or whatever it was from a decade ago.
And the Swift is the banking?
And Swift is a business framework, and so again, it's an update to the different messaging pieces that go along with that, the schemas and the
Finance transactions.
Your finance, the bank.
Yes.
Sorry, for worldwide.
Yep. So this is the kind of thing again where hopefully they'll do it more frequently, but it's nice that for those sorts of things, they're keeping up on those things and keeping them current, so you don't have to go out and develop all that stuff yourself. So that's kind of the basics. Now with the infrastructure as a service, what they've done with BizTalk, there's kind of two big pushes they had for the cloud or for Windows Azure. One is connectivity, which we'll talk about in a little bit, being able to, from a BizTalk machine, connect to other things in the cloud. And the other is being able to run BizTalk in Windows Azure. Right? One of the big struggles for some companies or some organizations is just getting that BizTalk environment set up, whether it's dealing with provisioning servers, dealing with licensing and getting some of those things done. And so they wanted to make it so that you can now go out and provision these things and set up these servers out in Windows Azure. Now they do this using the virtual machines infrastructure that's out there, and you have a couple different options depending on your needs. We'll take a look at here. So this is my Windows Azure subscription out here. Do you guys use Windows Azure? Have you done any work with these builds? So there's a variety of different kind of offerings out there in terms of what you can do in Windows Azure, both the platform as a service where you just simply go push websites out or push code out to run on their platform. But virtual machines really is similar to having your own kind of Hyper-V or VMware in your environment. You have your own data centers out here essentially where you can go and set up your virtual machines. So one example, the one I'm gonna run here, and I have a remote desktop to, is this demo machine that's running out there. And I went out, and if you go look at the virtual machines, I'm doing a new virtual machine from Gallery. What you'll see is it got a number of different things out here. And for me, I've got a BizTalk server, Enterprise, and Standard. Now, this is some of these you can filter these things out so you can see what's a supported option, what's not. In my case, because this particular Azure subscription is part of my MSDN, I get my benefits by buying the MSDN as opposed to directly buying the subscription, then I can filter out and see things that are just part of that subscription as well. But you can then take this and provision a virtual machine. Right? So I can take this enterprise item here. The screen resolution is going to be a and I can then go say, well, here's the virtual machine I want. Right? I'm going to give it a name, and here's the size I want. So they kind of give you the guidelines there. Thankfully, it's not just small, medium, large. They tell you, how many cores do you want, how much memory do you want. And they'll often tell you over here, I don't know if they do for this one, right? But they'll often tell you, there we go, medium is the recommended size for this image. So they'll give you a sense that, look, if you want this to run well, you're probably going to need this size of a virtual machine. So this doesn't take that long to set up. I'm not going to make you watch that. In the end, what you have in that case is a machine with Windows Server 2012 and BizTalk 2013 already installed but not configured. It's got all the SQL tools, but it doesn't have SQL and it doesn't have Visual Studio. So it doesn't work really well for a dev machine. Right? It will work really well if you're setting up a whole environment, but it's missing a bunch of the stuff you'd use if you were just going to kind of log in and do development on it. So what I did for this one is I created a new virtual machine from the gallery, but instead I just started with the SQL Server image. I took something like SQL Server 2012. So I created that virtual machine, and then it already had SQL installed. And then I could go in and put in Visual Studio and BizTalk and then any of the other tools that I wanted into that machine and start working on that. So I have just a developer machine out there running Windows and SQL 2012 that I can log into. So then you've got the ability to just remote desktop into that. I've got a connection here from the Wi-Fi or the wired connection that actually works pretty well. So I don't have to worry about running these virtual machines on my machine and carrying around an external hard drive and all that good stuff. So it can make a really good setup for doing that. Now the other thing about these, you can see this other one says it's stopped and deallocated. So I shut down the virtual machine, and then I actually came down here and chose to shut down as well. And when that's deallocated, you don't pay for the virtual machine. It's not running, it's not using any resources, it's completely deallocated off of their host. It's not running and using resources, so you don't pay for it. So again, that's one of the promises of the cloud and Azure is you pay as you go and you just pay for what you need. So you spin this thing up in the morning, you run it during the day while you're developing, you shut it down at night, you don't pay for it while you're developing. Now all these other ones up above here are a whole environment. So this is just a demo machine, it's a single virtual machine, it's workgroup mode, I can just develop on that. But these top four are a domain, a SQL box, and 2 BizTalk boxes. So the PDC is the primary domain controller, I've got SQL 01, and then I've got Biz 01 and Biz 02. All right, so a fairly typical environment for dev and test with 2 BizTalk servers sharing the SQL and an Active Directory domain that then has, is running all the users and groups. And so then I can log in to any of these machine, so let's just pick this biz02 and connect. There we go. Just downloads an RDP file for me for terminal services. I'm logging in with a domain account now that's part of that Active Directory domain out there. We'll look here and see the different host instances running on those two different servers. We're connecting up to that SQL server out there, and I can run this environment. Now, one of the benefits of this, the goal would be I want to be able to just go and set this up. They're not quite there yet. You have that gallery and you can pick an image, but they don't have kind of the one-click wizard to walk through and set this up. A colleague of mine, Stephen Thomas at BizTalkGurus.com, has a set of PowerShell scripts you can use, and he's really done a pretty nice job of automating it such that you have a variables file where you just set up all the information about your subscription, and then you run one script and it creates a domain controller, sets up the DNS, adds all your groups and users in it. He's got another script then that goes out and creates the SQL, creates the two BizTalk servers for you. So that actually gets you most of the way there. You set up these variables and run the scripts. This took me about an hour to set up this whole thing. But the other thing that Microsoft has done is on these images, when you install BizTalk, right, when you use one of those BizTalk images, there's this BizTalk provisioning folder on each of those images. And they've got two things that you really care about, this local service and this client.exe. And let me go over to oops, I don't know how to spell it right. I'll go over to number one. I should have paid attention to which one I was connecting to. Essentially, you have the ability to set up an XML file that has all your information in it. So you can tell it database names and SQL servers for all of those things. You can tell it which one of these features you want installed. So do I want business rules or business activity monitoring or the EDI? I can indicate those. And then you give it the data about the hosts that you want to create and the service accounts. So if you've ever done an unattended config or used the config files, it's a lot of the same information, but more of a generic form. And what you do then is on both of these servers, or however many you have, you go into that directory, that BizTalk provisioning, and you start up the local service. And then you go to one machine, and you run the client passing it this file, and it'll go out and configure the primary. So it looks at the servers here for these things, and it goes out, and on this first one, it's going to configure the group and set all that up, and then it'll go out remotely and talk to those other servers and do the configuration on there to have them join the group as well. So you can set up this file, you can run that through, and have that environment. So you kind of combine all those things together, and you can set up an environment fairly quickly using this scripted model to do that. I will say, having used this, I think the term you use over here in the UK is it's a bit dodgy. It's I had to run it a couple times to get things to go through. The good thing is, have you ever tried to configure a BizTalk and got kind of halfway through and it crashed? And then you went to reconfigure it and it said, oh, but you already have all these databases and these other things. And so you spend more time going through and kind of cleaning everything up. This tool actually will do that for you, which is both good and bad if you don't know what you're doing. When you run the tool, it'll actually go out and unconfigure everything first. Then it'll go and drop all the databases, and then it'll go through and reconfigure everything. So for setting up an environment out here, especially a dev or test environment, it's great. If you run it in a production environment, you might get into a little bit of trouble. But it does make setting up all those servers in there a little bit easier. Now, part of that is that, first you set up, a virtual network and an affinity group. So in Windows Azure, you have this notion of these networks that they set up for you. And they've got, all the networking stuff, the subnets and everything else. But you basically have your self-contained network then, that all those servers I created are now part of that, and they can talk to each other. But they're isolated from all the other virtual machines out there, both in my subscription and everybody else's. So they've got their own nice little network. That's why the Active Directory and the SQL and the BizTalk all can talk to each other really easily out there in that network space. If you want to, you can see at the top here, you can also configure point-to-site connectivity. With these virtual networks, one of the things you have the ability to do is connect them back to your on-premise servers. So you want to take advantage of this and get it all set up, but your BizTalk needs to talk to some service you've got on-premise, or vice versa. You want things to be able to go out and talk to this BizTalk. You can pull in those essentially VPNs, right? Those private connections between your Azure resources and your on-premise, so that you can talk to that BizTalk server directly. Now you can also publish things out, so you could, on that virtual machine, you could go in and publish out certain ports. So by default, they're going to be fairly locked down, but if we go to this demo 1, you'll see that the RDP, or the remote desktop, was enabled. But notice there's this notion of a private port and a public port. What you don't want to do is expose port 3389 on the internet and let people come through and probe and find your thing and then know, oh, well, 3389 is a well-known port for remote desktop, let me try that. So you can decide how you want to do that, but you can add other ports here. So you can add it if you want, you can set up a load balancer, but you can come in and add something in here. They've got some different options for FTP or SSH, right? Things that are fairly common that you might want to tunnel through. And provide those port mappings. You can set up a load balancer so that if you want that HTTP traffic load balance between the two BizTalks, you can do that as well. So the idea is that that network is private, both from the outside world and other things in Azure. You then have the control over what is it you're going to expose. And the nice thing about this, even with the RDP, while I'm working on it and getting it set up, it's great. But I might decide to come in here and delete that RDP port once things are all set up, because I don't want to have that exposure. And since I can manage all this through the portal anytime I need to, I can come in here, add it back in, remote desktop, and connect. Same thing with some of the WinRM, right, or the remote management. Questions about the Azure support?
This Azure support is completely new in 2013. It wasn't available at all in 2010? Or it was?
It wasn't in the sense that they didn't give you these pre-made virtual machines, and and if you asked them, they probably would say it wasn't a supported configuration. They're very good about saying things aren't supported until they say they're supported. And I think some of it just comes down to they don't necessarily want to test it. Because a lot of times, some of these things, for example, the whole Visual Studio thing, there's no good reason why the tools that they used in 2012 wouldn't work in 2013. It just didn't change that much, right? Or those sorts of things. But it's a matter of the testing time, and they won't take that testing time to say, it's okay to run this, and we'll let this install into this version until they get around to that next cycle. So yeah, that particular model, they wouldn't have supported the 2010 running out there. And again, it's just a matter of they want to test it, they want to make sure it's going to work for it. And all of the kind of the configuration utilities, that provisioning stuff is all new with 2013 in Azure. There's two licensing models, and I try and stay away from licensing because it always changes, but one of the changes with 2013 is the licensing is now per core. So it used to be, what was it, something crazy like 40,000 US per processor for an enterprise license, and now it's more like 10,000 US retail per core. So they kind of make an assumption that 4 cores is a standard server machine these days. So it's more in line with SQL. And it's also more in line with this idea of doing virtualization, where you have more control over whether it's VMware or Hyper-V or Azure. You have more control over saying this server gets 2 cores, right? Or this server gets this many cores worth of resources. And so they're charging you based on that, as opposed to assuming that you have a certain number, or kind of charging you for the whole processor. But with Azure, you can either do licensing based on these images, right, and pay for the virtual machines at a particular rate because they're BizTalk, or if you've already got licenses, you can bring those in and say, look, I'm bringing my license in and I'm using the license I paid for on these virtual machines. And then certainly if you have MSDN, your MSDN license would cover installing developer edition in there, for example. The nice thing about installing software in these is they're all on their data centers. So when you go download that 1 gigabyte DVD or whatever it is, it's ridiculously fast. So installing stuff on these is really quite easy. Adapters. This is probably one of the things that geeks who like BizTalk tend to look most forward to, because as we have more and more options for connecting with systems, adapters are really the way to do that. It's one of the big selling points of BizTalk, is this notion of being able to connect to all these different types of systems. And really, they started, so BizTalk 2010 or maybe even 2009, they started trying to move that adapter model even outside of BizTalk, making it available from SharePoint or from .NET. And they still follow that same programming model. But I don't think that it's really caught on much. I mean, I think people, the idea of the adapters is still something that is primarily used within BizTalk. And so the big ones, the new ones, are the REST adapter or the HTTP adapter, allowing you to go out and connect to HTTP-based web services that aren't using SOAP. SFTP, in 2010 they had FTPS, and everybody gave them feedback that we really wish you would have done SFTP, because that's more common.
Can you expose some orchestration as a REST service? Or is
Yes.
it still only easier?
No, you still can, yeah. I'll show you the publishing wizard is actually the same. So they have the SFTP, I'll show you that, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the interesting choices they made. And then service bus messaging. So this is the other piece of that Windows Azure connectivity. The service bus is a component of Windows Azure that allows you to do 2 different kinds of messaging. There's a relay, and then there's brokered messaging. Everybody know the difference? So the relay, I like to think of the relay as, in a simplified way, like what you'd see with instant messenger. Right? If I'm having an instant messenger conversation with you, often we're not talking directly because there's firewalls everywhere in between. Right? But I log in and I sign into some server on the cloud. Right? You log in, so we both kind of connected up to the server, and then when I send a message, it's just routed up through there to you. This is the same idea, but for REST-based messaging or SOAP-based messaging. Right? We have some public intermediary out there that we can both get out to, and we can use that then to relay messages back and forth. So that's one aspect of it. That was kind of the first iteration, but they've since added a lot of functionality around brokered messaging, which is very similar to what we see internal to BizTalk. Right? We can receive a message in, it gets published to the message box, and maybe our send port is stopped because that system's under maintenance. The message stays brokered, queued durably in BizTalk. When we start it up, it picks up and sends that. So this provides that notion of brokered messaging out in Windows Azure, out in the cloud. We can send a message out there, have it put in a queue, have it stored, and then I can pull it down.
Sorry, are you saying brokered is sort of guaranteed delivery? It can be.
There are some guarantees. Yeah.
rather than relays, you say, from what you said, it sounds like more of a broadcast type.
Yes, yeah, there are guarantees that if you deliver a message and it's in the queue, it's durable, right? They'll guarantee that they're not gonna lose it. And they're using Azure storage and things on the back end, so. And they also have some functionality out there around publish and subscribe models as well. So I publish something out into this queue or out into what's called the topic, and then it can get routed off to a number of different queues, one or many. So there's a similar kind of thing out there in the Azure cloud that we use internally. And then an updated SharePoint adapter that now no longer requires that silly web service to be installed on SharePoint. So that was always a big hassle. I have projects where people want to use Excel, or they want to use info path forms, and SharePoint's a great place for the users to go interact with that. But then we told them we had to go out and install a web service on their SharePoint, and they got a little edgy. Let's go here. So what I'm going to do first is take a look at. Actually, let's pull up and just briefly look at the SFTP. So, just to confuse everybody, this is the FTP, the original, which now also supports FTPS. So you just have to know that if you want to use that. The SFTP is different. It's a separate one. Now, of course, under the security, right, you have all the information around connecting up to the SSH server. So you can pass in your private key and password. So you can go out here and find the files that you've got for that. You can get the host key fingerprint so that you can make sure that when you're talking to the host, right, you've got that two-way mutual authentication. And then when we're doing a send, you'll notice there's a folder path, of course, the server and the message ID here. But if you've used the earlier FTP adapters, you see anything missing from here? Maybe nobody was using it. Maybe that's why they took it out. If we go look at a regular FTP, there's a lot more functionality. Right? There's the whole idea of a firewall proxy that you can configure. There's the SSL piece, of course, but then there's all this other things you can do in terms of after put, before put. You can log these sorts of things. Right? Some of them just don't make sense, like the representation maybe doesn't make as much sense since we're using SSH as a tunnel, but so this original one had a few more options, and if you were using those, moving to the SFTP might be an issue. My sense is that people probably weren't using them very often, which is why they didn't bother implementing them in the new one. They just focused on getting the protocol right. But what that gives you essentially is, using SSH, providing a secure tunnel, and then just doing normal FTP over it. And I think it's become more common in terms of secure FTP than what they were supporting before. So people were really just kind of demanding. But outside of that, it was not all that exciting. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to set up a couple ports here to do some REST interactions, or use the new HTTP adapter. And then most of the other stuff is set up, so I'm going to make you watch me type and configure all day, but I do want to kind of walk through this one. And what I'm going to do is just pick up a file that has an airport code in it for a US airport, because I found a service that actually doesn't require authentication. Everybody used to use all these services like Twitter and everything to just go out and do HTTP gets, and I think they caught on. I think we were doing too many demos, so they started adding OAuth and API keys and all these things. So I found one where you can pass any US airport and get back the current status and whether things are delayed, etc. And I've got this property, this airport property is actually promoted as this airport code. So this is a property schema in BizTalk that allows me to define certain things that I care about for routing messages and for seeing those details outside the message. And so this airport code, when it comes into my XML, there's an example with Minneapolis where I'm from, that value is going to get pulled out of the message body and stuck into the context or the metadata about the message, so we can use it for routing and other things. And so what I want to be able to do then is go in here, and set up, do it under here. I'm going to do a solicit response, so two-way. So go out to the FAA. Let me set this up before I. There we go. I'm going to set up a simple subscription on receive port name. See if I got it right. And then I'm going to go look for this REST adapter, and I'm not going to see anything called REST because they're using WCF Web HTTP here to do this. Now, this is one of those cases where there's all sorts of new frameworks in .NET to do REST. There's all the HTTP client things that come with Web API. It seems like they keep coming up with new ones. I think Windows 8.1 has some new client API. But they have this model in BizTalk already of using Windows Communication Foundation for all their SOAP-based stuff. And so it was really easy for them to leverage that and leverage the WCF model to do Web HTTP, which works just fine for making those requests. And frankly, since it's abstracted under an adapter, we really don't care all that much. So I'm going to go on at services.faa.gov airport. So that's my base address that I'm going to work from. And then down here, I'm going to put in some mappings, right, which is the similar model, again, that they've used for other items. That I won't make you watch me type. But I will pull it up here so you can actually see it. So this URL mapping allows me to specify what HTTP method I want to use and what the URL is that I want to use to go and access that. The other thing you can do here is provide an operation name. And that's when you're using the orchestrations of the business processes, right? Where you might have a port in your orchestration that's going to be bound to this, and you make multiple calls. You want to be able to map each of those calls and say, well, if the message is coming out of an orchestration and it's to get the airport code, then whatever the operation name is, right, here's the HTTP method and URL. If I have some other operation coming out of that orchestration or another orchestration, then I want to provide that. So I don't have to create a new send port for every single operation I want to do on this thing. I can reuse this one and just provide different URLs or URL templates essentially in the method.
So the operation element in that node is going to be only single, or it could be a few with different method names.
Exactly. Yep. And here I've left out the name because I'm just going to do straight messaging. I don't have an orchestration, so there won't actually be an operation name coming in the message. If I put a name in there, it would actually start failing all over the place. So I leave it out, and this then becomes a default, right? If there is no operation name, then do a get to this URL. Yeah. But you'll notice in that URL, I've got this placeholder for the code. I've got these little curly braces indicating that I want to put some parameter in. And this is one of the key things if you're going to interact with these HTTP services. The URL is something you're going to want to manipulate, and the HTTP headers. So this airport code then, if we go out here, we have that thing sitting in there, and that goes down to this variable mapping where we can then tell it, oh, for that particular placeholder, I want you to replace it with a value coming out of one of those message context properties.
And can you have multiple parameters?
Yes.
I cannot see. It must be an add button here.
Well, it reads it. Yeah, it reads it from the template. It actually parses this.
So if you put
Yeah, so if I came in here and did something like city code and edit, then it'll bring them both up. Yep. So what I need to tell it then is that information from my property schema, right? It's looking in the message context for this airport code. It needs both this name, and of course, because it's all XML, it also needs this namespace. So I'm telling it at runtime, when a message comes through here, look at the message context, find this airport code property, and whatever its value is, plug that into the URI. And that gives me some flexibility then, right, to populate that in pipelines or orchestrations or from those messages as I'm doing to make that a little more dynamic so we don't hard code things.
So if you added the second parameter, would it regenerate the schema when you define an ID value there?
If I went in here,
Yeah, well, if you added the second parameter here,
yep,
right? So now it will appear in the box, that's fine.
yep.
And then afterwards you click OK, and if you go back to XML schema, is that piece of XML schema generated
Changing the
from
schema.
here, or it's vice?
No, this is just one way. So I just have to paste that configuration in. I need to go in here
So you
and
can
insert a new
sharpen-
node and call it something else.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay, it's this way, not other way.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, it's really just configuration, telling it where to find that property. You've already
Yeah.
got it and created that.
So this is based on the schema, essentially, this thing.
Yeah, that's where I'm telling it to use that schema information. Now another thing that comes up here is, so I did a format parameter, and then pretty often you might want to do an and some other key equals foo, and then when I go in here and edit, it starts complaining. It's just because if you look at BizTalk and how it stores this information, it's going to take everything we put in these dialogues and it's going to encode it inside XML. And so it really doesn't like this ampersand that I put in there. But if you just encode it, so I do the ampersand amp, then it's happy.
That's XML notation.
Yeah, so you've got to kind of know that that's an issue, or do what I did, and when it happens, then you go talk to your buddies and find out. That's why it's broken. So we can obviously do other things like security if we need to do transport security or provide credentials for these things, we can. And then the other thing I said you might care about is the outbound header. So if you have to supply maybe an API key or some sort of static identifier to access that service, you can put that header in here and it'll attach that to the request. So that's one. The other thing is that typically for things like get and delete, we don't want to send a body, we just want to send the URL. But BizTalk, by its nature and default behavior, is whatever the message was, it's going to send it to the adapter. And so here you can tell the adapter, look, if I'm doing a get, don't send the body, right? I want the body to be empty when it goes out the end. I want that thing to just get the URI and just do a get request and not try and actually send any data along with the HTTP request. Got that? What did I call this? Airline requests. See if I got that right in the receipt port. Nope, airport requests. So I set this up as a solicit response, which means it's going to go out and do that HTTP get, and then it's going to bring back a response. And right now I'm just picking up a file. I don't have anything to receive that. So I have this send port up here that's subscribed to anything coming in on that FAA service port. So basically any response that gets back, we're going to dump out to an audit folder out there. We're going to put it in the airports out. We'll look here. Okay, nothing in the out directory. So I'm going to do one for Minneapolis, so we'll copy that. Paste it in there. So it went out to the service, passed that MSP as the airport code in URI, and now we get back the information about Minneapolis. Oh good, like snow and fog and mist. I think I'm glad I'm in London. And no delays, of course, because we know how to handle that sort of thing. Seattle, if they get a little snow, and shut down. Paste in Seattle. And we get back the Seattle data, because that's what went over there to the service. So it works pretty well. They've got, they kind of thought through the URI piece and the HTTP headers. They got some feedback early on in the betas of this that they really needed the ability to suppress those bodies, and they added that in. go in here, let's go in and do, I'm going to do a request response. I'm going to do a requests. I would do the same kind of thing here, the receive location. I can use that web HTTP. Figure that. So I'll let airport queries, service 1, that's the base, and then we have the same model for the parameters coming in. I'm just going to, same thing, name, method, and URL. Now because we're receiving, what's going to happen is when they do a get to this URL, then we have the variable mapping again for the code they pass in, and we have an operation name. So those are all going to get populated on the message. So when parameters come in as part of the request in the URL, we're going to have access to those on the message that gets published. And we can provide a particular name if we want to provide that operation name for mapping up to orchestration ports and other things. So here we have that exact same syntax, but it's kind of going in the opposite direction. Now again, we have that code, and we have that same model here, but what we're telling it is, I want you to take whatever was in that URI, and I want you to populate now that context property. So we're going the other direction on the receive. We're going to populate the context property from the URI. You can see because it's request response, again, we can tell it if we want headers to go back out with the response, we can do that. We can suspend request messages. Now these aren't checked because typically with these HTTP adapters, you don't want to open yourself up to denial of service type requests. So by default, they're not going to suspend all those messages because then somebody could just potentially hammer your endpoints and fill up your message box. All right, airport queries, we have to remember that. So is this enough? If I do an HTTP receive location on BizTalk, is it enough just to set up a receive location like that?
Trigger it somehow.
Yeah, and they made a decision a while back with all of these HTTP adapters that they were going to rely on IIS. Even though with WCF you can throw up an HTTP endpoint from any process, they decided that they were going to use IIS as that front end for all HTTP traffic. So we use the same WCF publishing wizard that you would have used before for a SOAP interface. We'll just pick that same adapter, that WCF Web HTTP. And if we want, we can have it go create the receive locations, but I tend to do that manually. This brings in some of the service bus. If we want, we could make this a relay out to the service bus. Create a request response port here. And I've actually got SharePoint running on here, so my BizTalk is on 8080. Unfortunately, I think every keystroke they go on and check the virtual directory to see if it's there. Which on this virtual machine is painfully obvious. And so it's going to go out now and create a virtual directory for me, and it's going to have a WCF service endpoint in it, and its sole purpose is to take that message and proxy it on into the to BizTalk. So refresh this. There's our airport queries. And the other important thing here is that it's running in a particular application pool. This enables it to run as a BizTalk user that has rights to the BizTalk database. It's going to publish messages, it's going to read configuration. All these HTTP pieces have to be running as a user that has rights to do that. So through the application pool we've set up, it's running as my BizTalk service. So I should be able to go over here and browse to this service one. Make sure it comes back. Airport queries, service one not found. So if I go look at BizTalk and I receive locations, oh, I enable it. So it's going out and validating that that received location exists, so that when it gets messages, it'll be able to pass them in. All right, so it's up and running. Should lift that up. Do airport queries, and then I can put in San Francisco. Forgot one thing though, our receive port, we set up this new port, airport requests RR, and our service was only listening for the one-way port we had. I'll say if it came in on either of those ports. Oh. Forgot the lovely service one.svc. So we're making a request through that receive location, a REST request, just did an HTTP GET to BizTalk. Message came in, it routed it over to the send port, made an HTTP request over to that FAA service, got the response and routed it back to us, and we can see then we got the San Francisco airport information. So you can do it both ways. Again, it's a receive location. So for orchestrations, for other things, once that message comes in, once any adapter hands that message off to the pipeline to BizTalk, they're all messages, right? They can go to orchestrations, they can go to a number of different send ports, whatever you want to do with them after that point. That's one of the benefits of the BizTalk adapter model is that it doesn't matter how you get it. Once it's in there, it's a BizTalk message and you can use it. Questions about the REST adapter, the HTTP? We got a couple others that are already set up that we'll look at real quick. I've got a similarly simple message schema here for an order. And it has those two promoted properties here for customer ID and order total. So I've got an order properties that goes along with that as well, and it has those items. Now out in Windows Azure, I've got a service bus namespace. So service bus is the messaging piece that does relays or allows me to do this notion of queues and topics. A queue is essentially just that. It's a queue, right? I put messages in, I take messages out. We've got some options in terms of, how long, the time to live for messages, whether or not we want to use sessions, those sorts of things. We'll do duplicate detection, right? We can do ordering. So it's fairly robust, but pretty typical queuing. But it's primarily accessed over HTTP. And now recently they've added support for AMQP, which is kind of the de facto standard for queuing. And so we can enqueue messages out there, and this then allows us to have clients that come in that maybe are occasionally connected, or again, just to take advantage of normal queuing in terms of scale, to set those things up. Topics are kind of a front end, if you will, almost in front of those queues, where you can have a topic, and then you have subscriptions. And subscription is really just kind of a sub-queue that has some sort of a filter on it. And so we could go in, for example, on this M3 orders T, the topic, and I could just create a new subscription and call all orders. and you'll notice it has this filter. The default is this 1 equals 1. Basically, all messages that come to that topic go into that particular item. Go ahead and click OK. You can see then we have that default rule, which is just 1 equals 1. But these others, though, the rules, you'll notice I'm doing something similar to what I might do in BizTalk to route messages. Well, if the order total is greater than 10,000, then the large order subscription should get it, or it should end up in the sub-queue. In the small orders, I have something similar, but of course I have it if it's less than 10,001. So I can send messages out to this topic, and rather than just sitting in a bucket, they can go to one or more of these different sub-queues or subscriptions that are out there and filter.
So some of that could replace some of the basic BizTalk functionality.
Yeah, in fact, there's a component that they've released in Windows Azure called BizTalk Services. It's building on top of this. So they are kind of using this as a messaging engine for a lot of those pieces where you can do a lot of the same kinds of patterns out here as well.
So in those subscriptions where you did all, and say you had a large order as well, you had a large order, it would go to all and large order.
Correct.
Good.
Yeah, so if we go here and we'll see if I'm right. Copy in large order. Paste it there. So it's going to go in my receive port. I'm just picking up from that file. I've got this orders to Azure. Now if we look at that, again, we have an adapter for SD messaging, and this is specifically for those queues and topics. And here it's just going out to that topic, so the one that ends in T. I give it the URI for that. So here's my specific namespace that I kind of own. And then underneath that I can set up these hierarchies, and that's the topic name. And then we have a different kind of authentication here. There's an access control service that sits out there beside the service bus. And so I've got to give it basically my username and password, right? Issuer name and key, and then there's rules that you can set up and who can send, who can receive. Now I wanted to route based on that order total and those customer IDs, but the problem is that BizTalk has one way of handling those context properties, and the service bus has its own notion of brokered messages, right, and properties on those. And so the adapter knows how to take these things and map them from one to the other. So I'm going to give the namespace of that property schema, and then when the message is ready to go out, it's going to look at the message and say, do you have any properties, right, from this namespace? All the properties on the message, or any of them from this namespace? If there are, then I'll populate on that message for the service bus those same property names and values. We should be able to go and look at our all orders. I can do messages, and here I'm just going to peek so it'll stay on the subscription or the queue. And you can see there's the customer ID and the order total. Those will come out from my message itself. The adapter populated these broker message properties so that I can filter on that order total. I can actually see the message in there as well, so I can see the customer ID and the total. So it did go to the all orders. Go look at the messages in the large orders. It went there as well. So we've done a publish once, and we've got multiple subscribers, and they all get their own copy of the message. I'm going to do one other send in the small order. So we would expect over here to find that. If I notice it doesn't even give me the messages here. I'm running out of room on this 1024 display here. If I look at the service broker, active message count, if I could get to that, is actually 0. So why aren't there any messages on this particular queue? Well, the features that we have on here, there it is this forward to. So you can set up these targets or these queues to have this notion of kind of this chaining of things together. And you can use it for a variety of different design patterns. It might be a fan out, right? You get a bunch of messages on the subscription, you fan it out to 20 different subscriptions, and then from there maybe you fan it out more, or you forward it on to different places. But I've said that I want to forward that on to just one of these queues. So don't store it on this particular sub-queue, forward it on here. So that's where that message, we'll go keep those, that's where that message is sitting with that order total, that small order. So there's a number of different things you can do out there with the service bus. It's a pretty powerful broker messaging system. From BizTalk's perspective, though, we can talk to these topics and queues, both to send things as well as to receive them. So if I actually go turn on my receive locations, this one is for the queue. We'll go look, we'll see it's pointing out at that queue. If I enable that, then it should get that one. Now we're behind. All right, so there's my small order that I got off of that queue. Get rid of those. Go enable that receive location for the topic. And if we look at that, you'll see the address there is the subscription itself. We can read that back there, but we're going out to the service bus, and we're going to the topic, right? My M3 BTS orders T /subscription/large orders. So I'm just treating that thing as an addressable item of this subscriptions piece in there, and that then is basically a queue that's going to pull those messages off of. So then we've got the large order that came in on there. Now that other one's still sitting out there. I don't have anything listening for it. So that all orders that I set up, we go peek that. Those are still there. Oh, the all orders. Yeah, both of them are still there because I didn't filter based on the size, so they're both still there. Which means some other entity, right, or some other receiver could come along and pick up their copy of those messages as well. And of course we've got that symmetry as well, right, for these items where it has the broker message property. So if we get order total, right, off of that message, it comes back in, it's going to take it and populate in the context order total of that namespace and whatever the value was. So that mapping on there works both ways. What if you're using SharePoint at all, or SharePoint with BizTalk? Okay. I'm going to show you this one briefly. And actually, there isn't a lot of change functionally to this. You know, the idea is that you've got a document library and people are putting info path forms in there, or XML or Excel or whatever it might be, and you want to pull them into BizTalk, or as part of your BizTalk process, you want to send things over. And so, you know, generally, you're just going to point it to that document library on the receive. If you want to filter, you can point to a view and say, hey, I only want things that fall into this view of that document library. But the big change is just this line right here, this use client object model. So SharePoint, 2 versions back, or the last version, 2010, they introduced this client-side object model that allowed you to do a lot of the things that used to have to be on the server for. And so when you use this with SharePoint 2010 or newer, 2013 or 2010, you can use that client-side object model. So you no longer have to install any code on the SharePoint server. And this is the default, and actually you don't have to install any specific SharePoint code on BizTalk either. It just, out of the box, has that support and works with that. I've just got this one set up with a particular user, and it'll go out here if we go look at orders. We can see that the message goes out there, the XML, and you can use things like this this view, this processed orders, shows nothing right now. It's filtering based on a particular property on that item. We can go in and edit the properties for this. Indicate that yes, it has been processed. And now it'll show up in that view. Now we're looking at the processed orders view and it's in there. And oh, I don't have that enabled. So this will go out, look at that particular view then and pull back just those items that are in the view. Eventually that'll disappear. So it is set up as a polling adapter. You can tell it how frequently to go out and check for those items. But we'll pull that back. All right, so the last couple items here. One is the management tools. There's good and bad. They added this notion of the dependency viewer, which is kind of an invaluable tool as you're working with some of these things, and one that should have been there a long time ago. They've added support for PowerShell, kind of, and then there's some more support tools that are available. So if we go look at the management console here, one of the things that's creeping up in the bottom is this dependency statistics. So if I go look at a particular port, like this orders relay, and I click View Dependencies, it'll go out, pull back information, it'll tell me, well, there's one receive port that's using this particular receive location, and this location is using a pipeline. You can go and click that, and you can see, oh, that's the pipeline that it's using. Now, more likely, what I would do is maybe come in here to a pipeline, trying to figure out what's using it. Again, you can do this a different way. You can right-click that XML receive and see, oh, there's 4 receive locations that are using this pipeline. And then you can click on that and find out what they are. This becomes really crucial as you start working with shared applications, shared resources. If you have that common pipeline that does something like flat file processing or zip file processing or something, and you're using it in multiple applications, when you go to update it, it gets really kind of hairy if you don't know where it's being used. So this is critical, being able to go and kind of find those things easily and see what's using that particular resource. So you can do it for maps to find out what ports they're getting used on. Again, if you go try to update a map and it's being used somewhere, you won't be able to change it. Right? So being able to go and find those things is great. The UI looks like they let an intern do it. So that's the piece that isn't that great. I mean, there's this gray Windows Forms user control down there that barely fits and isn't resizable and always shows up even when you don't want it. So that part makes me feel a little unhappy. I'm not sure I am all that convinced that it's quality, but it seems to do what it's supposed to do, which is give you back that dependency information. Now with PowerShell, I'm going to open up, this is a 64-bit machine, and 64-bit PowerShell. I'm going to go out and do get ps snap in, all the registered snap-ins on here. And if you look through the list, you're not going to see anything that says anything about BizTalk. That's because it only works in the x86 version of PowerShell. We do get ps snap in register. Now you'll see this BizTalk package. So the good news is there's now PowerShell support for a lot of the things that you might want to script in your environment. The bad news is they didn't actually go in and do a full-fledged effort on these things. They took something that was an open source piece, which is great, but it isn't even installed by default.
That's a bit weird because when you're going to have it as an x86 server with BizTalk.
Well, yeah, so it's a 64-bit server, but I'm running the x86 version of PowerShell, which needs to be on there. And the reason is that the snap-in, all the PowerShell stuff, uses the BizTalk Catalog Explorer API, which is only available in x86. They've given up on some of the tools in 64-bit. They just don't even do it anymore. But that one, as long as you're running in a 32-bit processor, you're okay. So if you go to the SDK,
Seems a bit weird why they build anything in x86 for BizTalk.
yeah, at this point, everybody's installing almost exclusively on 64-bit. In fact, I'm trying to think, what was the last version of Windows you could get that wasn't? Was it 2008 or 2003? I mean, I don't even think they support a non-64-bit version anymore for this stuff.
There's so few adapters.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, the
And
adapters,
standard,
it would
so.
be a big update. So what you have to do is you have to actually install this. Right? So you use the .NET install util and just point it at this guy, and that actually kind of registers the PowerShell extension on there. Before you do that, it doesn't do anything. But the README, walks you through that, tells you what you need to do. It even tells you need to be an admin in x86 mode. We can add that, so it's, oops, I went back to the 64-bit again. So what I can do then with PowerShell is I can go with this, I get command for this type, module, this name, then I can see all the commands that they added there. So there's actually quite useful ones because a lot of this stuff you can't do from script, whether it's VB script or if you do it your own PowerShell piece. If you write some of these things yourself, or you have to use the command line tools, a combination of different things, the BTS task, which allows you to do some of these things, or the rules engine deployment stuff, which allows you to do some of the others. But they've kind of pulled them all nicely in here and even added some things like adding an application reference or resource right, that are in there that you wouldn't have otherwise. Importing and exporting the bindings, and so using this, if you're doing scripting today on Windows, most people are using PowerShell, so it simplifies that model of doing that. So I can do something like export bindings, the path might be BizTalk, applications, I get tab completion here, orders, I can do destination, I can do C, BizTalk. Files, orders.xml. It's taken that binding information and exported it out for me for that particular item. So you can do that same notion if you're scripting installs or doing other things of that nature, then you've got the ability to go in and script all those different pieces, right, to add application references and add your assemblies and pull your bindings in. Restart, stop and send ports and those sorts of things. So if you're doing scripting, whether it's scheduled tasks to turn stuff on and off or deployments, these can be quite helpful as you add. So the other piece here is they've added this support tools folder as well that has some common utilities, and I'll just touch on a couple of them here. The assembly checker really just allows you to check two things. One, is the assembly in the global assembly cache on the machines? And two, is it deployed as a debug? Right, so if you want to go look at your production environment and make sure that your BizTalk assemblies aren't out there in debug mode, you can do that. This PSS diag for BizTalk is all about collecting data for when you really need help and you're going to go to product support, right? That's the PSS at the beginning, right? It makes it simple for you to go run a couple lines of script here, go run whatever process you have in BizTalk that's causing you trouble, come back, finish it out, and then it gives you a zipped up file that you can send to product support that they can crack open and get all the stuff that we're going to ask you to do without them having to walk you through 15 or 20 different steps to go collect it, right? So it'll turn on all the tracing and collect all the diagnostics, zip it up, and then close everything out. the one you maybe are more likely to use is this message box viewer. Now, typically when you're doing a BizTalk environment, you're in the admin console, right? That's your tool for going through and doing lots of stuff. This is the unpolished thing from the product support engineers that's going to allow you to go out and grab all sorts of information. So you can go through and identify all the different things that you want to include or not include. I'm just going to go ahead and collect here. So it's going to go out and collect all this information and then generate a report for me, and hopefully the report will fit on the screen better than this thing, which is fixed size. But it'll generate a report, and it'll have all sorts of information, but the key things it'll provide you are some of the best practice analyzer feedback. So it'll tell you, all right, if you have issues with your databases, if you have issues with the way your SQL or your enterprise single sign-on are set up, if you've got issues with your hosts and the way they're configured, it'll go through and analyze all that stuff. One of the things that I really like, though, is there's probably BizTalk 2006 or 2006 R2 timeframe. There was a guy showing off tools that would allow you to trace messages and how they flow through your system. This is not nearly as cool as what he was showing, but if you do message flows by receive port, and you go in here by the receive ports, you can look at the orders in, resize this, and I can see, oh, I got this thing in through this particular receive location, the pipeline, right, and then I can see the send pipeline and the send port that it went out. So you get a sense of that message flow in your application. If we look at this, this one obviously is a lot easier. Came in through our service, went through, and it went out to that service over there. So again, you get into the warnings, you can see, my SQL Server agent's not running on here. That's important. Right? I don't have my backup jobs configured yet. Right? So really flagging those things for me that I need to do to get this in a healthy environment. Looks at SQL, looks at the BizTalk services that are running as well. And if you need this last one, you have to go download it because they update it fairly regularly. If you need this, you're really in trouble. Sadly, I needed it a couple months ago. But this is the BizTalk Terminator, and this is the hammer to go and fix your BizTalk. Right? For me, it was tracking data. When we did our upgrades from 2010 to 2013, all the tracking data was getting collected in the message box, but none of it was getting moved over to the tracking databases. And we went in and kind of manipulated everything by hand, and it just wasn't working. You pull this in and you tell it, hey, I want to go fix the tracking, and it goes in and resets everything, and we lost a little bit of tracking data, but it fixed everything and it started working. So this is one of those things, again, where you go here if you're really having serious issues and you've kind of exhausted other things or product support tells you to. But it really helps you get in there and fix those things that otherwise you're digging around in SQL tables and trying to find out what values to flip and change. Performance improvements.
Just a quick question. In
Uh-huh.
that folder, very first, there is X, no, next one.
Oh, the message box view?
Yeah, probably this one.
Yep.
Oh, I see somewhere it was xlang.exe file.
It was what? Xlang?
I think it was in utilities.
Oh.
Support too?
Yeah, that's where we were.
Yeah.
If it was in here.
Yeah. At the bottom? Yeah. Xlang has two.
Oh, yeah.
What is this? So there is Xlang?
Well, Xlang is the language,
Like view file.
yeah, it's what orchestrations essentially compile down to Xlang and what it uses at runtime. So that must be part of what they use when they're collecting information around the orchestration runtime.
By the way, can you, well, I suppose you can, I don't know, but can you import, export orchestration in any format, like command to or extend even?
Yeah, if you do a new BizTalk project, there's two options. One is empty, and the other is a BEPL import. So if you have a
Oh, you
BEPL
can
file or a
import
set
it,
of
though.
resources, you can pull that in.
So that would be a standard Drupal 2 based schema import probably?
I would have to check if they've updated. I'm guessing they haven't. BEPL's one of those things that Microsoft starts to support
Okay.
because customers demand it and then they don't do anything with it. So I think this has been around since 2009. So it may only work with the original versions.
But then if you can import it, you supposedly should be able to export as well.
Yeah, you can, yep.
If you can open an orchestration, and if you have,
I don't have one. Yeah.
and
Yeah, there's,
file export will be or something. On the top main menu, maybe?
do that.
Or right click on the orchestration. No.
No, I can't remember where they, there it is, export to BEPL from the orchestration.
Yeah, I just click it for a second just to check. It's not there.
Oh, it's gonna fail because I don't have any ports or anything else.
Yeah,
But yeah, it should
okay.
export it out, and then you've got some control over some of these things as well. The target namespace when exporting to BEPL.
All right.
So I'm just going to quick walk through the performance improvements on XSLT just to show you what kind of improvements we're looking at. I have a somewhat large XSL, it's even called somewhat large XSL, that is using a EDI 810, I think, or no, an EDI 832, a catalog. And so we've got lots of data, but also it's got quite a few items in the map that it needs to do. And so I've taken that XSLT and just in the .NET layer, I'm just going to run that through. So this first time I'm going to use XSL transform, which is the old model. In fact, when I build it, it'll probably tell me that it's obsolete. And I'm going to do two things. I'm going to just run it in series, right? And then I'm going to try and run it in parallel. And I'm going to just mark out the times there that I've got for load time as well as the time to execute. And I'm going to do it 10 times. So I've got 10 of the input files. They're all the same. You can see it took about 0.37 seconds to load.
When you said large, you mean the XSLT itself is large or the data set is transformed?
Both are true. Yeah, the XSLT itself is fairly complex as well.
Like 100 kilobytes or something?
Yeah. I think, yeah, so 100K for the XSLT, and then the file coming in is meg.
Oh, well, maybe it's only me.
So now that I've warmed things up, I'm going to do a fair run here.
Then you're going to use the compile XSLT.
Yep. So running those 10, it takes about 7 seconds. That's what I was seeing the other night on mine, folks. Parallel takes about 5. You go look at the output. Right, they're all there. They're all the same size.
So I assume you can use XSLT with extended objects and functions by using C#.
Yep. Yeah. So when I do the set this one as the startup. When I do the new one, there are a couple differences. And one of those is, as you mentioned, with the compiled XSLT, that's one of the changes. Is if I'm using script, I've got to set it up to enable that. Obviously, all this stuff just gets used inside of BizTalk when you run maps. But I just wanted to kind of pull it out of BizTalk and make it a little simpler to run through the compiled transform. And so I'm using that same XSLT, those same input files. The only real difference here is using the compiled transform. So we'll run that
10 times, I bet.
Yeah, so the other one's about 7 seconds.
Yeah, 7 times.
That one, even on the warm-up, was 1 second. So they, Microsoft has reported they're seeing about a 4 times increase in speed on those things when they use it in BizTalk. Here it was closer to 6 or 7. So it really does make a big difference. And essentially what happens in the compile transform is that it loads up that XSLT and then compiles it to Microsoft Intermediate Language, essentially .NET Intermediate Language, so that when it runs a lot faster. So the last thing that I'll mention is the ESP toolkit. Is anybody using the ESP toolkit today?
Maybe.
Maybe. All right. So I'll tell you 2 things to watch for. One is Microsoft. One of their big things about ESP in 2013 is that it's an integrated install. What that really means is you have a separate link on here to click. That's the extent to which the install is integrated. So after you've installed BizTalk and after you've gone through and maybe installed all these adapters and things, then you can come in and install the ESP toolkit, which really just runs the MSI. So it's a little bit of a lame answer if you ask me, but they do have this configuration here. Website will want to set it up on BizTalk, and all that stuff should work. So let's see if this works. So they do have this kind of quicker configuration now, where it'll go through and configure everything. One of the nice things they added was it used to be when you did the toolkit, you'd have this basic configuration of the databases, and then for all these different pieces they supported, like the enhanced exception handling or the itinerary routing, they would make you go run a separate MSI and install these applications into BizTalk. Now, if this ever finishes, if I expand this, you'll see you can actually choose those applications right from the config tool and say, yeah, I want this one, I want this one, and it'll go through and set those up for you. Couple things I'll warn you about. One is on my on the slide here. It's not really there. There's the design of the itinerary designer is a Visual Studio component to visually describe those. If you go out even today and look at the documentation, they'll tell you there's this Visual Studio installer, this V6, on the media, and you'll dig around forever and search and won't find it. It actually installs by default. You just might have to run your Visual in Studio from the command line and pass a /setup. Right? Basically reset Visual Studio to recognize that this extension was installed. Which kind of speaks to how well it installs, because there's a couple of pieces that just fundamentally don't work once you install it. The config file is using the old config file, and there's one assembly that almost nobody uses, but it has an extra L in DLL. So when it gets registered in the global assembly cache, it's never found. So if you happen to be using that one feature in your itinerary, it'll fail all over the place.
Extra L in DLL.
What's that? Yeah. So the file name is wrong. So it's one of those pieces where it feels like they kind of rushed it, and maybe somebody didn't do their job testing that part. But at least
like such a simple fix as well.
I don't even know if they fixed it in the cumulative update yet. Yeah, that's going to take a while. So it's going out and configuring everything, hopefully. So that part is nice that you can just give it this one page and it sets everything up. So those are the main things. Oops. Where did you go? Obviously, there's an update to host integration. So if you're talking to mainframes, they've got some updates there, a lot more integration with WCF. The BAM alerts now take advantage of SQL Mail in SQL 2012. So we don't have it was a dependency on a SQL 2005 feature, notification services, that hasn't been around since SQL 2005. And they finally have killed that off, thankfully. The problem is when you set up BAM, you'll have to set up BAM alerts, otherwise the install or the configure will fail. Again, something I would hope they would fix in Service Pack 1. So a little bit of work to do on the installers, but hopefully that gives you an idea. All right, I think for a lot of folks, whether it's the platform updates, the performance improvements in the mapping, the addition of the adapters, for a lot of people those are all reasons to upgrade if they're using something else, or to start with 2013. The nice thing about the way they're handling BizTalk is that as you upgrade, a lot of stuff isn't changing. Right? The core engine doesn't change, the mapping doesn't change. All of our BizTalk 2010 solutions just started running. We upgraded in 2013 and they kept running. We didn't have to rebuild and redeploy them. Any questions?
Anything around registry repository type stuff?
The ESP toolkit has most of that and has support for varying and extensible backends. So they've got UDDI, they've got business rule-based repositories and other things that you can use to look up addresses, to look up what adapters to use, and all that configuration. So the ESP toolkit is really where you find a lot of the registry stuff.
A big gap. So developers know what services are out there and how to.
Yeah, and it ships now with BizTalk, their version of UDDI. I don't think they changed anything for 2013. I think they're still running their UDDI 3 that they updated for BizTalk 2010. But they do have the UDDI server that you can install, and then the ESP toolkit can leverage that as well. Find out what I was yelling about. Well, thanks for coming. I appreciate it. If you've got questions, let me know. And Chris asked me to tell you, don't forget to pull up your app that they talked about this morning and put in your session feedbacks. Because it really helps me and it helps them to figure out what people want to see and what they like. And then I think you can see it in some sort of drawing, right? With prizes. So that's a good thing. All right. Thanks. Enjoy the rest of your show.